Okay, so I was going to continue on with Durst, and we were looking at Durst's findings. What did he find so far in our discussion? What was the things that, the conclusions he was starting to come to? First of all, what were we talking about on Tuesday, broadly?
Gerrymandering and how that relates to municipal annexation.
Yeah. Does anybody want to translate that?
It's the redrawing of like different districts to go around certain communities or include other communities to balance out ones that they may not agree with as much.
Yeah, yeah. And so we're looking at particularly like how city annexation, what was city annexation? Do you remember this? Let's translate it. What does city annexation mean in like normal English?
The city wants to increase their borders. They go through means to extend that to neighborhoods that may not be in their jurisdiction, but they take it over so they can improve the tax base or offset demographic changes.
Yeah, yeah. And so our author's interested in how does this process reflect racial inequalities, right? How does it construct racial inequalities by excluding people from the ability to vote in the place that essentially they live, right? The local government. So what was the findings that he found so far? What were the two relationships? And if you're looking for the spot where we had left off, we were looking at page 948 and 949. Well, I think we just left off on 948, so. So what two relationships did we find? It's two different. What relates to the percentage? So what was the statistical chart looking at? Do you guys remember? Yeah.
Wasn't it comparing like the population of like whites to blacks in a certain area, and like the relationship? So like kind of talked about later about when they gerrymandered, there's more whites, and more blacks are kind of talked about. There's like 1.1%, was it?
Yeah. So what they're looking at is right, the racial ethnic demographics of the blocks being annexed, right? And what correlates to that, right? So like what is it that's going to determine the racial makeup of annexed blocks in cities across the United States? Right? So it's a big sample of a bunch of different cities. And so the first one that we found is that there's a relationship between the percentage of whites for determining the percentage of African Americans in the cities in blocks annexed, right? So that's the one relationship. What was the next relationship that we talked about so far? How does this differ from Hispanic? What did we see? Yeah.
Like only significant annexation of like Hispanics happens when like the demographics of cities change.
Yeah, so if demographics are shifting towards larger Hispanic populations, then people will generally avoid annexing blocks of people who are Hispanic. Otherwise, they don't. We kind of talked about regionally. And this also kind of like shows, like we talk a lot in sociology about the color line. Have you guys ever heard of this idea? So like how people are perceived, right? We kind of exist in a system of a racial system that's binary, black and white, right? groups in between, how we view them, whether we view them as minorities or not, is actually a little fluid, right? So in some contexts, people will treat Hispanics as if they're white. In other contexts, they'll treat them as if they're black, right? And the same thing goes with like people from Southeast Asia, right? So like if you're in California that has high populations of people from Southeast Asia, particularly poor populations of people from Southeast Asia, you have a tendency to treat them like they're minorities. In other parts of the United States, people treat people of Asian descent as if they're white. So in essence, it's kind of capturing that, right? That in some areas regionally, right, where people are feeling threatened by Hispanics, they treat them like minorities. In other areas in the United States, they don't. Okay. I'm going to go through some of this a little faster. So they find that there's no relationship to how poor a neighborhood is in the likelihood of it being annexed. So people are making decisions on the basis of race, not on the basis of finances. Part of that also has to do with the fact that wealthy neighborhoods usually fight their own annexation as well. So if you are a particularly wealthy neighborhood, you don't generally want to be taken over by the city because one, like that sort of spreads out the tax base, right? Like if you can keep it. Is anybody here from a major city? Or any? No people aren't from a large. No one here is from a large city. What city?
Sounds like the Bay Area.
What's that?
The Bay Area.
The Bay Area. Are there any like outlying wealthy neighborhoods that aren't a part of San Francisco?
Yes.
Yeah, and so like how that happens is usually when San Francisco if they wanted to annex those populations, they'd fight it, right? A good example and closer to home for me is Grosse Pointe in Detroit. Grosse Pointe, it's like a caveat that they've moved around, right? But essentially the reason why is because Grosse Pointe is so much wealthier than Detroit that they don't really want to be annexed, so they'll fight it. On the other hand, poorer neighborhoods have a tendency to want to be annexed. So anyways, yeah. So, but they don't find any support that there is fiscal motivations, right? That there's a correlation between how wealthy a place is and whether it gets annexed. Then we have this oversight thing. This is on 950, oversight and other limits of direct democracy. You guys see where I'm at? So they may catch the change in the law. So there's a reason why this is becoming a different way of gerrymandering. Historically, it hasn't been. Anybody catch this? What changed about annexing cities?
There was like a Supreme Court decision that repealed one of the sections of the Fair Housing Act that made it easier for cities to do this, I think.
Yeah. It used to be that if I wanted to annex a neighborhood, there was a commission at either the county or the state level that I would have to send my annexation plans to, and they would have oversight. So if I was doing it in a prejudicial manner, they'd be like, no, you can't annex like that. And so there was a lot of oversight over city annexation. That law was repealed recently. So basically what happens is now sometimes there are, like they may have locally set up commissions or some sort of safeguard, right? So essentially this section, what it's doing is it's testing those different safeguards and whether they work. So in some places you had them literally set up basically what they had before, but they just run it at a local level. This is called the Boundary Commission, which is on this line. What do you see for that? What do those numbers look like? What do we notice about it on the chart? Remember the lesson on reading charts. Stars, and whether it's positive or negative. Only thing that matters. What do you notice about that number? Where do we see stars? Do people just not read that? Is that the problem? Or are people being hesitant? Because it's 8 in the morning.
They both have stars, but what did the stars mean again?
So the stars mean that there is a relationship,
Oh,
right? So in statistics, it's all about, are these things related? If you guys remember, basically what the stars indicate is what is the probability that the numbers we have are due to random chance. And if you remember, that probability is really small with stars, right? Do you guys remember that? It's down here. They put this on every statistical chart, even though it's always the same, right? This is where I was like, so the chance that the percent chance that it's due, the percent that it's due to random chance is 0.001. If there's 3 stars, 0.01, right? Meaning that we can be 99.99, 99.95, right? So on and so forth. Percent confident that it's not random. That's what those numbers mean. And so, yeah, you're looking for stars. Stars are crosses, and whether it's positive or negative. So where do we see stars on this boundary commission? I'll go back up to show the. Pull this in a little tighter so it's easier to read. So for this line right here, boundary commission, where do we see stars?
Well, there's stars on both of them, but the percentage white is negative.
Yeah, so what does that mean? If you have a boundary commission, what's changing about the places you annex? People remember what the negative means? Negative is going to mean that when one number goes up, the other goes down. That is a dead marker. It means that when one number goes up, the other goes down. If there's no negative, it means that when one goes up, the other goes up. Right? So having a boundary commission up does what to the number of African Americans in the areas annexed?
Does it increase?
It increases, right? So if you have somebody who has oversight over it, a commission to look over the annexation plans and possibly veto it, right? Then the racial makeup becomes more equal in the neighborhoods being annexed, right? Which is why the number of Caucasians drops and the number of African Americans go down. So basically what this says is what? If you have a commission that looks over it and vetoes it, the practice is more equal. So people can't use it for gerrymandering to keep people from voting in the cities they live in, right? With any of the other measures, right? So this is another example of one. They have to have a judicial review. The courts oversee it. Doesn't make a difference. No relationship. So judges will not make things more fair, generally speaking. Right? But the county has to approve of the plan. No difference. Right? So basically what they're finding is that the only real safeguard to keep gerrymandering from happening is either what the laws that they had in place before, or when people do something similar, which is that their third party who's uninvested has oversight in making sure that it's done ethically. Make sense? Okay. I think that's it for the relationships I wanted to bring out from the article. I just also think it's good practice. I try to make sure to do at least one statistical chart in all of my sociology classes because it's good to learn how to read those things. It's really kind of in a lot of ways the language of at least quantitative methodology. Okay, any questions or thoughts on gerrymandering now that we've finished that up? Or statistics and how to read statistical charts? Yeah.
Can you just explain one more time what gerrymandering is?
Yeah, so gerrymandering, do you remember when we threw up the maps? And they had like, basically like, it would needle out in different ways? And we were talking about redrawing districts. Gerrymandering is essentially any time you alter what voting blocks are geographically to exclude populations. So that happens at the district level. When they redraw districts, they'll do it to exclude people on the basis of race. It has to do with how they draw county boundaries. So over time, counties will be sort of fingered out into places to make sure that they get that basically like certain populations' votes can't overcome other populations. And then for annexation, right, it's essentially going out much in the same way geographically and making sure that only white populations are included within the city annexations so that African Americans aren't represented. Or gerrymandering is also often politically motivated, so it's not always on the basis of race, right? It's also often on the basis of parties. But it is done and has been historically done on the basis of race as well. So, does it make sense? So today is, other questions. Did anybody else have a question about gerrymandering, race, or thoughts they want to share, reactions? I hate using my phone as a clock. Yeah.
I was just curious about like the, like kind of, I don't know what exactly you're calling them, but kind of like cities outside of city limits, like they're a little bit more wealthy or something, like how would they go about, like are they kind of gerrymandered as well, or are they their own area, or I'm just like kind of confused about that.
Yeah. So it works a little bit different, and that's the difference between annexation and the other forms of gerrymandering we're talking about. Because like the other forms, how it affects is it's basically like, are you represented at a state or national level, right? With local governments, right, with city governments and annexation policies, the question is are you seen as part of the city or not? So like, a lot of times what you're seeing is like, when they annex, they'll avoid African American neighborhoods as a way of excluding them from decision making, even though they're very much so often a part of the city they live in. But they don't have to provide services for them, right? They're not as big of a tax base, so they don't take money from them. A lot of times cities want to annex wealthy areas, but those places often have their own self-governance and don't actually want to be a part of the city. So they're providing their own services for themselves, but because they're wealthy, it's easier, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it would actually, like, in some ways decline, they're afraid it would decline the quality of their neighborhood to be included in the city. So really, like, in some ways, what kind of area you are is going to determine how attractive you are to a city, as well as, like, whether or not you really want that. So often, like, very wealthy suburbs will, and you'll actually sometimes see on maps where there'll be wealthy suburbs that aren't a part of the city, even though they're almost completely surrounded. Or they are completely surrounded by the city.
There's one that I used to nanny in, Medina, that's like 3,000 people. And they have their own police force and everything, like they're their own little tiny city, but it's because there's a lot of rich people there, and like Bill Gates was there, so it's like, they have the money to be able to fund that. So I was just like curious if like, they broke that off, or like how.
Yeah, and they probably historically were their own town at one point, and the city grew up around them. I had an interview in, has anybody ever been to DC? The DC area? Yeah, you said you're from Northern, no, I'm thinking of somebody else I talked to in the last 24 hours, sorry.
That's okay.
We had a meeting, I had a meeting with somebody else who was from the DC area, so I was like, well, yeah, so I had an interview in Rockville, Maryland, which is like embedded in DC basically, but, right, like, it's wealthy enough that it maintains its own township and it has its own police force and it has its own, right? So yeah, that does happen a lot. That's the difference between that and what we're seeing with African American neighborhoods, though, is that African American neighborhoods generally want to be a part of the city, and actually are usually pretty dependent upon the city. But it also means things like often like people in African American neighborhoods have to walk a couple of miles to get to the mass transit system, as opposed to being sort of incorporated into the city, things like that. So, other questions or thoughts people have? Well, if not, we'll push forward on Collins. So, So I think we should basically try to think of this as a conclusionary period, right? We're going to conclude this book. So to do this, I want us to sort of back up and rather than sort of go piecemeal through the conclusion, I want us to just back up and sort of think about where we've been, what we've read that we haven't talked about, and how it'll fit in, right? How we can kind of see this as one thing. Going back to I usually like to assign these because I feel like probably half of all academic literature is written in these sort of long monographs, but generally we don't assign them in undergrad courses because they take a lot of time to read and go through, right? And they're a little more repetitive than if we have just new articles, right? So it's important for us to kind of pull back and see what are the parts. So I'm going to have you guys start by just literally looking at the contents page. This is before the page numbers, even before the Roman numeral page numbers. So what we're going to see is there's these first couple of chapters, chapter 1 and 2, right? And these are going to outline the major themes. So let's think about and if you guys even wanted to thumb through those chapters and kind of look at them, that'd be appropriate. But if we just want it from memory, what are what are some of the major themes that run through all the chapters we're looking at? What is Collins? Because there's certain things that Collins is consistently interested in. If you want to think about it, there's a lot of information that we've read, right? But those are what the book is about. And when people talk about it, those are the things they're going to talk about. So what things kept on, and you can just look through your notes too, that might be a good way of doing it. What are some of the things that seems like Collins talks about over and over again?
Intersectionality.
Yeah, that's one of the big ones. It's going to be intersectionality. Do we need to go over that again? I'm guessing not, because you guys wrote about it in your take-homes, right? Intersectionality and the interrelated concept. What's the similar concept, but not quite the same thing?
Matrix of domination.
Yeah, the matrix of domination. And maybe just one sentence. Give me guys one sentence on what this stuff's about. One sentence statement. What is intersectionality and the matrix of domination?
Like where you fall in the hierarchies.
Yeah, it's going to have to do that there are multiple hierarchies, right? And where you fall within them is going to drastically alter your experience of them, right? So you fall at an intersection, right? Right? So this should be super familiar by now. Okay, what's another concept that's really important to Collins? What other things does she talk about over and over again?
She talks about images and different kind of, I can't think of a different word, but images that are assigned to Black women and how they're expected to act.
Yeah, so she's going to be interested in, certainly, yeah, what she calls controlling images. When we talked about that, we also talked about the idea of ideology, right? She's really talking about the same thing, but using more everyday language for it. These controlling images are a big part of of what she's talking about. What are some of the controlling images? We don't need to necessarily go through them in detail, but what are...
Like mammies and welfare queens and Jezebels, I don't know, I'm missing one.
And what sort of, how do they have us think about black women?
They kind of put them into a box and like say like this is how they're gonna act in this situation, or this is how like they should behave in society.
Yeah, it's either like they're not behaving right, like they're too strong a women, they dominate over their husbands, they're not like good enough parents, or they're like basically like kind of like in a lot of ways like acting like slaves, and then that's good, right? Which would be something like the mammy. So that's kind of the her controlling images. What else does she talk about a lot? There's a couple of things that are still pretty important to her. Who's she always? Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say she talks about how different oppression, like it's the same oppression, but it manifests itself in different ways through different eras, in terms of slavery to lack of job opportunities and stuff like that.
So yeah, that's going to be more like, so if we come down, like if we think about these are going to be our theoretical stuff. So this is our theory, right? And then she's going to have applications of it. In most of our middling chapters are going to be these applications of the theory, right? And that history that we read and talked about in detail, like the history of black women across the United States, that's her application. She's doing an application of intersectionality. How do we read history through intersectionality, right? It's an application of it. It still shows up a lot, right? It's one of the more important applications for certain. But I don't know if we could include it as like her grounding ideas. There's something else. Did anybody pick up on? Oh yeah, go ahead.
It's kind of broad. And I was just gonna say she really talked a lot about like the black woman's different relationships, like with family, with loved ones, and like her relationship with work.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. I guess that was kind of more broad throughout the book, but.
Yeah. So relationships and work, right? And what she's kind of doing there is also kind of this, she's showing the way in which when we use intersectionality, right, you can't keep, because if you think about it, these themes are themes that you would get coming out of feminism a lot, right? These are themes that you're going to get more out of studies of race or inequality. So she's sort of like fluidly moving between them all the time, which she's kind of trying to show, and this is one of her major themes, right? That we can't keep these ideas separate, right? And so we think about like, we started pretty early in the book, right? Basically in the introduction of the book, she does all these critiques of white feminism, right? And so that's actually part of that theme. So she wants to provide a critique of both feminism and race theory as being exclusionary, right? Only counting certain people's experiences within those subsets of populations, right? So that's definitely going to be a major theme as well. There's one more major theme. It has to do with who is she always citing? Who are the voices that always pop up in these stories, or in these chapters? She's always like quoting people. You guys have probably noticed this, right? And we talked about this early on, but we haven't really like brought this back out again. Who is it that she's quoting throughout the book?
Black women scholars.
They're black women, but are they necessarily scholars, as we would normally define it? I see your, do you want to elaborate?
No,
What's that?
I don't think so, no, I guess.
Anybody notice what they are? So they're either activists, or they're poets, or they're songwriters, or they're, right? Because essentially, like, part of her theme, right, is that black women have historically been sort of ostracized in normal intellectual communities. So her idea is, one of her other major themes is resurrecting black women's perspectives. Right? How is it that we can talk about black feminism throughout the ages, despite the fact that there are no black women in academia until the 1960s? Right? So she's taking these different voices of women. If you notice, a lot of the people she quotes are slaves, right? And she'll often identify that, right? So that's so these are her major themes that she plays with throughout the book. So, and then if we look back at the content page again, so all these themes, right, are brought out in one way or another in those first two chapters, that very first section, right? So that's where she identifies all these themes, and then she's going to have a variety of applications, right? The first one we've looked at already is her application of the history of race in the U.S., right? Particularly race and labor. What are some of our other chapters? Just looking through your notes, sort of see what you can remember from the intermediate chapters.
There's a lot of chapters on like motherhood, sexual politics, love, relationships, and how black women interact with their families and people around them. Yeah, and so she's taking these ideas and she's applying it to the history of race. She's applying it to relationships. Right? Motherhood. Sexual relationships. Right? And once again, this is these themes, right, being applied in a lot more detail. That's what she's doing in all those sections. She talks a lot about, she applies it to activism. We haven't really talked about that chapter yet. So this is one from a while back. So we have chapter 9, Rethinking Black Women's Activism. Just a question, and this is a totally off-the-wall question. When you guys read, what do you do? Do you guys make notes? Like, how do you guys take notes? I'm just curious.
I just like take them in the book and like highlight stuff.
Yeah, I mean that's what I do. Do other people do different things? No. I didn't know. Some people like take notes on the side, right? Like a separate notebook or something like that. I was just curious. And then also, like with people reading online, do you guys still, when you guys are, I see a lot of you like get your laptops out. Do you guys take notes in there as well? You should probably, just as a future reference, if you're going to be talking about a text, you should probably bring the one you take notes in, right? Because like if I ask you broad questions, you're going to be able to answer them better if you got your notes on hand, right? So just as this is more just like something I didn't think of saying before, but like it's probably a useful thing. So okay, so backing up, right? In this chapter, we didn't talk about what did people do. People remember this chapter, chapter 9 about activism? Is there any themes that people can pull out of this? Yeah.
If I remember it, it was kind of like a quiet activism of like who's the student doing things and like not necessarily going out and like yelling in the streets or something, but like just like not doing what people are telling them they have to do or expect them to do.
Yeah, yeah, and it's pretty related to when we talked about, do you remember back when we talked about like the weapons of the weak and those sort of ideas, right? These sort of more like somewhat anarchistic ideas of if you're an oppressed person, resistance looks different than you would think, right? And so this black women activist, she extends upon these themes even more, right? And so what she's looking at in this section is she's basically looking at the way in which we normally perceive activism. Do you guys know what this word means? When I talk about activists, what are activists? What do we normally associate with somebody being an activist? What do you do as an activist?
Like march, organize, plan things specifically to change like a public policy or norm.
Do you have anything you want to add on that?
He pretty much nailed it, just someone who's fighting for a change.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's usually how we use the term. It's somebody who usually fights outside of government, right? Outside of institutions, right? If you want to think about protesters, that's really kind of the archetype of activism. So basically in this section, she wants to show that like we have a weird way of thinking about activism. To be an activist, you have to be removed from the situation. We generally think of activism as something that's done by somebody for somebody else, right? So like there's this weird thing that within politics, like to some degree, like if you argue or try to fight for your own, it's often seen as illegitimate, right? But if, as a third party, if I want to defend ... cause, right, then it's seen as legitimate. So there's like this weird expectation of a specific type of activity, right? Often a certain like feeling about objectivity towards the situation that sort of undergirds the idea of activism. According to Patricia Hill Collins, are black women generally activists in this sense of the word? Who is it that mostly joins protest movements? We could also say this like, if we wanted to be, who is it that often rebels against things the way they are? This is like a little known truth that nobody ever thinks of.
Younger people?
They're young, often people who are younger, right? Older people get set in their ways and they don't really care to take the risk or whatever, right? I don't either. I'm old. What else? Who else? Another way to put it, who doesn't get super involved in political movements? Who doesn't, you know, if you talk about things like overthrow governments, who doesn't do that kind of stuff? So we already got old people. Old people don't do that stuff. Who else? Just looking for guesses. Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe like the middle to upper classes.
It's actually the opposite. Middle class people are the people who generally take part in protest movements, who generally are politically active. Poorer people don't, as a general rule. Why? Why would poorer people not have a tendency to be politically active?
They don't have the time for it.
Yeah, essentially like their lives are restrictive enough. They don't have the time for it. They don't have the ability. Like, what do you do if you're a protester? What do you have to be able to do? Do you just protest wherever you're standing? right here, right now, what do? You travel to other places and gather together with other people, right? You have to have some degree of affluency to be able to do that. Does anybody know why younger people have a tendency to actually be a part of movements? What do they have a tendency to be doing? Most of the people are students, right? A lot of the people are students. Historically, students have done a lot of activist work. Why is that, do you think? Your lives are less restrictive than people with full-time work. I mean, I'm not saying you guys are lazy and not working hard or something like that, right? Because you guys are. But it's not as restrictive as like, you have 3 part-time jobs and you have to like make sure that you can show up to each of them, right? And you may or may not have ready means of transportation. That's not what your lives look like, right? So it's easier. So her point being is like, we sort of are disparaging against poorer people or people who are more on the fringe because they're not activists, but she wants to claim that that actually breeds a different form of activism. And so, like, this is like her phrase, survival is a form of resistance, right? If you exist in a system that tries to get rid of you, surviving is resistance. So, like, her point is that, like, African American women have a tendency, rather than to be politically active in this sense, right, have a tendency instead to be active in changing things at a really small level, right? If you work for a company that has unfair practices, you try to change them. If you live in a neighborhood that has things wrong with it, you try to change things at that level, right? So it's not sort of like engaging in this sort of large national or international politic, right? But it's a form of activism that's somehow more like immediate. We're going to see this lines up really well with her discussion of epistemology too, which is what I really want to, out of the remaining empirical chapters is the one I really want to focus on today. So, does all that make sense? Cool. Okay, chapter 10. So, who are books written for? A book like this that you've spent the last month and a half reading, who are they written for? Do you find these like at airport bookstores? Is this something like people read when they're on the John or something? A little light reading before bed, right? Who do you think reads Black Feminist Thought by Patricia Hill Collins for the most part? Audience is really important to understand writing, right? Yeah.
People who are reading it for educational purposes.
It's going to be people who read it for educational purposes. Yeah. What else? Who do you think most of the people who have read this book are?
They're scholars.
Yeah, yeah. And so if you don't know anything about scholars, they're really nitpicky. Has anybody ever caught on to this? Like, scholars love to criticize each other. It's basically like scholarship in a lot of ways. We're going to talk about her being somewhat disparaging in this aspect of academia. But scholars are basically just engaged in a constant argument of people critiquing each other for centuries, right? If you really want to think about thought, that's what it is, right? So a lot of times you just have to cover your bases. This chapter is basically that. So anybody want to venture a criticism of Collins' book? What might be something difficult about Collins' book? She's attempting to create this sort of overarching theory of difference between human beings in general. But what does she have a tendency to just focus on consistently? what population does Patricia Hill Collins like to talk about the most?
Black women.
Yeah, yeah. And so, like, she gives, in a lot of ways, black women a very important place within both activism and thought, right? Are black United States women the most oppressed people in the world? No. And so this is actually a very likely critique of Patricia Hill Collins, particularly like, you think about like, we spent a lot of time early in the class talking about colonialism in other parts of the world, right? These are the places where the most poverty exists, right? Not in the United States. And that actually makes people's lives worse in other parts of the world, right? So like, outside of the context of this book, a lot of people would be like, do black women really have that essential of a place, right? So this is a chapter where Patricia Hill Collins tries to argue that they still do, despite the fact that they're not oppressed because of their sort of way of being able to interconnect with people, right? Once again, like, I think this is what you would refer to in academia as a Tolnick chapter. And that usually means that it's more about defending yourself against criticism than it is really about like, is really connected in with the larger idea. So I'm going to kind of brush over that. It's still good for you guys to kind of look at that and get a feel of what it's like, but I'm going to brush over that a little. Okay, how much time do we have? Cool, great. Let's talk about epistemology. So the last chapter that we're going to talk about today, and then the conclusion is just pulling together these themes, right? So like if you look back through the conclusion, it's essentially all it's doing is pulling through these major themes with the empirical chapters and pulling that all together, right? But the last empirical chapter I really want us to look at is Black feminist epistemology. So, okay. Did anybody here look up the word epistemology in reading the chapter on epistemology? What is epistemology? Do people know? Yeah.
Isn't it like how someone like forms their knowledge and truth of something?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Anyone else want to weigh in? Might epistemology be? I like to refer to epistemology as the question, how do we know? Right? What forms the basis of how we know things? Right? Does anybody know the division in philosophy between epistemology is often juxtaposed to something else? People know what this is? The opposite of epistemology is ontology. And ontology is the study of what is. So you could take almost all philosophical questions and lump them into one of the two. So all philosophical questions are going to be concerned with epistemology, how do we know what we know, and ontology, what is, what's out there, what's real. You know. So we spent most of our chapter here. Most of our book we've spent here, right? This is the chapter where she's going to talk about epistemology. She wants to talk about black feminism as a way of, a way of knowing. So this is interconnected with a larger discussion, particularly a discussion that's very common within feminism, as well as stuff on global inequality. which is referred to as standpoint epistemology. And standpoint epistemology is going to be interested in like what place people occupy in social structure and how this determines what they view as being true. Right? Does that make sense? This also casts major doubts, and this makes it a form of something referred to as post-positivism. Post-positivism. It also basically casts doubt on the idea of objective science. So, in one way or another, it's going to claim that, yeah.
Can you just repeat what you said, like the definition of standpoint epistemology?
Oh, yeah, sure. So standpoint epistemology is going to be any theory of knowing that's going to claim that how people decide what is and is not true depends on their place in social structure. So if you want to think about it like, do you guys know what I mean by social structure? Not everybody in here is a sociologist. What is social structure? Do people know this? When I use that term, social structure means like the institutions that surround us, right? So that context. People used to say the word society. Society fell out of vogue. No one uses that term anymore. And that actually deals with some of the stuff we were looking at when we talked about ethnicity. Nobody really believes in a unified society anymore. That we don't have unity within a given society, so you can't talk about society in that sort of singular way. So instead people talk about social structure, which has more of a feeling. Does it make sense? So it's basically, if you just implant the word social structure for society, it's very close in its meaning. So where people fall within society, within social structure, is going to determine, right, how they validate claims, how they think you can get to knowing whether something's real or not. Everyone follow me on that? Any questions so far, or thoughts people have? Okay, so standpoint epistemology is a form of post-positivism because it creates doubt about the ideas of objective science. And basically it wants to claim that a lot of what we consider objective science actually reflects middle-class, white, male ways of knowing, right? And so in that way it becomes itself a little suspect. And there's also like a long history of science and how science interacted with colonialism. That bleeds through in a lot of this literature. A good example is there was a book in the early 90s called, Can Science Be Multicultural, right? And it's the same sort of idea. It's Susan Hart. But but the idea is that you have to take into consideration the people making the claim, right? Not just the claim that's being made, right? Does this make sense? Okay. So if we look through the chapter, right, there's this whole section that starts on page 271. And this is where she's going to get into her criticism of objective science, which she refers to as a Eurocentric epistemology, meaning that it's centered around what?
And centered around like Western ideas and specifically like white male scholars' ideas.
Yeah. So the idea is that and we can think about this too. Like we often do use science in this way as a weapon against other people, right? Part of the big justification of colonialism initially was that people in Europe knew better than everybody else, right? And that they were essentially just spreading the truth about the world as they went about taking it over, right? So in a lot of ways, like science becomes suspect in this way because it represents that the only right way of knowing, right, are ones that grow out of how people in Europe think. The other ways of knowing, other epistemologies, are automatically going to be thrown into question. And that's basically the same thing as understanding the rest of the world is backwards. There's actually like there's a really famous, like one of the really early anthropologists, is an anthropologist by the name of Fraser, and he's one of the founders of anthropology. And his big text is basically just that, like, other parts of the world, it's just superstition. It's the only thing that guides people's ways of thinking about the world, right? It's just based on superstition and false religion, and then like they become like essentially enlightened scientists as time goes on, right? And so societies that are scientific are more advanced than other societies, right? And I think here you see that same sort of language. Okay. So I want us particularly to take a look at the section on positivism on page 273. Oh, by the way, do people know that word, positivism? This is a common word used in academic circles. Positivism gets used broadly to mean a worldview that favors particularly like the idea of neutral science, right? It's particularly geared against sort of like, the idea is positivism is like a very like old-fashioned idea of what science is. And so the various critiques of science kind of usually revolve around a critique of positivism. Does that make sense? Do people understand what I mean by that? Great. Okay, so I'm going to just get a volunteer to read this, starting with this paragraph at the very end of page 273 that carries over in 274. Who wants to be the voice of positivism? Okay, go ahead.
Are you talking about positive approach?
Yep, approaches, yep, right there.
Positivist approaches aim to create scientific descriptions of reality by producing objective generalizations. Because researchers have widely differing values, experiences, and emotions, genuine science is thought to be unattainable unless all human characteristics except rationality are eliminated from the research process. By following strict methodological rules, scientists aim to distance themselves from the values, vested interests, and emotions generated by their class, race, sex, or unique situation. By decontextualizing themselves, they allegedly become detached observers and manipulators of nature.
Okay, so what is that saying? That's like, if you will, our definition of positivism. What is it saying? Whenever somebody's ready to translate, jump in. Yeah, go ahead.
It seems that when it's talking about researchers, that they're letting their own like opinions and experiences and kind of biases influence kind of the end result of their work and aren't being very rational with it.
Yeah, so it's kind of like doing like a double speak in here, right? Like if you notice she drops words like allegedly a lot, right? So the idea is that science presents itself as being objective, right? So like it presents itself as like, well, I removed all of my biases and I just kept to the facts. But is that anything that ever happens? Can you do that as a human being? Can you remove yourself from your experiences when you're working? What do people think? Why could or couldn't you? Because to some degree this becomes the debate, right? The debate is, can we obtain objectivity, or is this just something that allows us to distance ourselves from the way we're biased? Right? Another way to think about it is if you're biased, you don't know it. Like, people aren't generally purposely biased. They're not going out to be biased. Like, the thing about bias is if you have it, you're blind to it. So essentially what positivism says, well, we just need to follow rules. If everybody follows rules, then they'll remove themselves from it. But is that necessarily true? Right? Some of you guys are in my research methods class, right? As well, right? And so, like, if you think about like what you do in research methods, right? Inevitably, you hit that moment where you have to start interpreting things, right? Yeah, like things are meaningless until they're interpreted. I was talking about this last week, right? And so basically, the idea is like objectivity gives us the feeling that we're not being biased, but in the end, what the knowledge we create depends a lot on who we are, right? It depends a lot on our experiences. So where sort of what she's going to describe as Eurocentric white epistemologies favor being removed, detached, and unemotional, she's going to claim that black feminism does not. This is actually related to a critique, so she's extending upon a critique that comes out of feminism a lot, which presents sort of like science as something extremely masculine, right? Because the idea is sort of like, reason is good, emotion is bad, right? And so there's a certain, if you will, bias to that emotive ways of knowing. Caring about people, empathy, right? All these sort of things are sort of extradited out of science, seen as suspect, right? And so what she's going to say is, like, depending on who you are, right, depending on your standpoint, what ways of knowing are suspect changes. And we should take seriously that whole segments of the population, right, have a different way of validating knowledge. Okay, so then after she sort of has this critique, she then tries to build a positive way of seeing how black feminist perspectives constitute a different epistemology, a different standard, a different test for whether things are true. So this is going to start on page 275, where she's basically, if you will, offering a alternative criterion for truth. Yeah.
So I was just wondering, so positivism, is that saying that science can be objective or science can't be objective?
It's saying that it can be, right? And so post-positivism is the critique of that idea, right? So positivism is saying that you can. This is a, yeah, we'll keep it there. It gets really problematic when you actually start to like read positivists because they don't necessarily say that. But anyways, we'll keep it there. We'll keep it in Colin's language. I won't complicate this too much. It's already complicated enough. Okay, so yeah, any other questions or confusions people have? Are these terms that people have heard of before, or is this all kind of new territory? It's all kind of new territory? Cool. How about we pick up on Tuesday with the criterion for truth in this section? We only have 5 minutes to get through it, so I'd like to give it a little more time than that. So, and then from here on out, it's just 2 articles a week. So, different topics all the time until the end. Before long, you guys will be presenting your own research. It's maybe my favorite part of the semester is listening to you all talk.